We'll conclude St. Dominic's and Kevin's School there, and we'll move into our next presentation with Joanne Pitman, the Director of Administration and Learning at Grande Prairie School District. This presentation is entitled Building Skills and Taking Action, System Supports for Connecting Student Voice to Quality Instruction, Collaborative Practice, and Purposeful Engagement. Joanne is responsible for leadership development, program implementation, and review, and intentional leadership practices and utilizing evidence to inform system and site decision-making. Her particular interest is understanding the way in which student evidence can inform instruction, programming, and supports. In this session, Joanne will outline a systemic approach to building on the skills and opportunities of school leaders when making effective use of student voice represented through our school data. Using an evidence-based professional learning cycle, she'll focus on the process by which a system integrates the data to inform system-level goals of quality instruction, collaborative practice, and purposeful engagement. So please welcome Joanne for her topic, Building Skills and Taking Action.
Turn my, we're good, excellent. You know, people who know me understand that I love numbers. I hated math, but I love numbers. Interestingly enough, despite that love, I'm going to start today off with a story, just to set things up. It was the end of the 19th century, and in northern England there was a mill. And a mill owner who was distraught because his boiler system was not working. In fact, every aspect of his system, while he could hear steam running and he could hear clanking noises, everything out on the floor had ground to a halt. And he was in a panic because time is money in a factory, and he needed that system up and working. And he had called in experts from everywhere to come and help him and establish exactly what the problem was, to no avail. And he was becoming increasingly more panicked. A little later on, a fellow in blue coveralls and a small toolbox walked in. He was one of his factory workers, and he wondered, why is he here? And the factory worker said, you know, sir, I think I can help you solve your problem. And he looked at him with a bit of pessimism and thought, I don't know if you can really help me solve my problem. You've got nothing but a small toolbox. And the factory worker in the blue coveralls said, give me 10 minutes. And so out of his toolbox, he took a small rubber mallet. He walked around this complex system of pipes. And he tapped gently here, he listened there, he walked back and forth, and then returned again, curiously, to get a larger rubber mallet, walked decisively over to one part of his system of piping, and he gave a solid thunk. The effect was instantaneous, and suddenly, out on the floor, all of the machines sprung to life. The mill owner was absolutely ecstatic. He couldn't believe that this had happened, and he said in his joy to the factory worker, charge me double your price. I'm so happy that you were able to fix my problem. A little while later, he received the bill, and he was hit with complete shock because despite having spent equal amounts on experts from across the country, it was only 10 minutes, and it was a rubber mallet, and it was one of his own workers who had no formal training. And so he was astounded that he was being charged 100 pounds, which at that time was an exorbitant amount of money, to have this work done. And so he asked his secretary, contact this man, ask him to send me the breakdown of his bill. And so when he received it, it was interesting because there on the bill it said, for 10 minutes of tapping, 1 pound. For knowing where to tap, 99 pounds. And you know, I start with that story because it's easy to grab at things in education. And it is easy to grab at programs, and it is easy to grab at expertise. But it is our intentional and careful thought in understanding what the information, the evidence, the data in front of us is telling us that truly will empower those of us in schools and in systems to make the difference. Today's presentation is really going to focus on what, why, and how. So in my role within our central office, I get to focus on data. I get to focus on the work that is feeding into our programming. And then I also have the joy of working with an exceptional group of school leaders who really want to be empowered and focus on what their students are telling them and what their teachers need. And so the what of today is understanding how we deepen the analysis and action planning for our school results. And the why, well, the belief is that we know when we develop consistent structures, we know when we develop consistent patterns of looking at our data across the system and within schools, we become better at using it. And how do we do that? Well, when we use structures and tools, we practice them, we're going to be that much better at making change everywhere. And at the center of this, in Grande Prairie Public School District, we focus very much so on the evidence-based professional learning cycle, based entirely around Helen Timperley's work, and she's done exceptional. I probably would be seen as a groupie a little bit of Helen Timperley, but fundamentally it is this inquiry mindset that moving into understanding what do our students need to be able to know and do, and this goes beyond the typical 3 questions from Do 4. Because when you break this down into more detail, it is all about what is the evidence that's informing my practice? And then what is the evidence of my practice? And what is the evidence of the learning that I'm engaging in as a professional? This isn't about a rubber mallet that's thunking one spot, but in fact it's developing the ability to move throughout all of this cycle, not just as an individual, not just as a grade level team or department, not just as a school, but as a whole system. And so to kind of give you perspective in our context, we have our Alberta education outcomes that we work through. And on the exterior sides in the green boxes, you see our strategic framework, where our 4 key areas that we're focusing on are collaborative practice, effective leadership. We have a young leadership team. We have a lot of work and development and that brass tacks of leadership that everybody is collaboratively developing, quality instruction, and then finally purposeful engagement. And of each one of these, as I say those pieces, all of you may be attributing a different definition or understanding of them. And so that's really also, when you look at the R School information and data, and as we dig into it, I always ask, what do you believe is connected to that particular question? Because it's our understanding of what engagement is, and I appreciate I've pored over Dr. Wilms's kind of summaries around the definitions of engagement, because it means so many different things. Because when we talk parental engagement, we could just be talking volunteerism in a school versus engagement with their individual child's learning. And so these are the things that we question as a system. I apologize, this one's a little bit blurry, but when I reference tools that help bring our system together in clarity around the skills we're developing at every level. So at the very top, you see the school improvement planning. And our school results feed into every one of these different aspects. And what we do is we practice them just with a different focus. We use the exact same evidence-based professional learning cycle, but with a different focus. It's not something new when we're talking about it in central office. It's not something different when a school team is looking at their Our School results for their grade. It is the same questions, so that we are talking the same language. That helps us nuance our response to what our students are telling us. On your right, the case management focus there is really about identifying Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 from an RTI concept. We're using the data to help us understand collectively, what are we doing in our teacher teams for all students within my grade? Tier 2, we're looking at different partners joining us at the table to dig further into what that inclusivity needs to look like. And in Tier 3, we're talking about a student. And everything always moving in that process. So nothing is new, nothing is a one-off, nothing's different, it's connected in every way, all centered around the evidence-based professional learning cycle. One particular piece that I would give you as an example is within, again, the structure of learning. When we identify our student needs and teachers are asking themselves, our school leaders are asking all teachers, and as a system, we're asking ourselves as a group, what are we wanting them to learn? What are the learning intentions and goals? Making clear, what are my students' strengths? Where did we get that information from? And what do we consider to be valid evidence? I have intriguing conversations with people who sometimes like to discount what our school results might be for a variety of reasons. Our kids are different. Right, but you know this replica school line here? See, here's how that's measured, and it's important to understand how the replica school reflects and connects to you. Here's how the norms are across Canada. Here's how norming works. Let's understand that this is a starting point, and it allows us to inquire into the evidence. And what's important is typically, when we first started this work, we stuck with the first top of the box, right? It was all this series of questions. And what I was able to observe is that for many people, they were not confident in the evidence they were using. In fact, they couldn't name it. It stuck to PATs. It stuck to a couple of benchmark tools. And it was all formalized and didn't empower action tomorrow. The belief that immediately you can do things. And so when we started identifying categories, well, for evidence, student feedback and voice in learning is important. How do we collect that? Our school results is one of the ways in which we do so. Student attitudes to school. Again, our school results. Analyzing student work as another way to make the connection to some of the pieces we start to ask when we get our school results back. By the way, I'm really had to practice not using tell them from me. It's very difficult in my mind, this year there's a couple documents that reference tell them from me, and I didn't make those changes because we had stuck with that, but then I made some adjustments this year. So what are some of the system structures? And I mean, all of us have a variety of structures in our systems to support school leaders to analyze evidence. One of the things we intentionally did was built again around the cycle of evidence-based professional learning was a mindset of during all of our admin meetings to have time to really focus on what that evidence is actually doing. And then to step outside of the actual work of saying, okay, well, here's the chart I see in front of me, but a little bit of that metacognition. What is my default when I analyze this information? Why do I immediately go to anxiety as the first thing I look at when I know that my R-School results are back? It has a place, but when you start digging into career pathways, when you start looking at the variety of pieces around relevance and rigor, and then you start triangulating that into some other categories, that is empowering, a really empowering piece of this evidence that as a system has informed much of our planning. So at our all admin meetings, we focus on how we use the model to use the data. It's not just something that gets parachuted in when we finish on February 24th. It's part of something we have continually throughout the year. Specific work on planning the ways in which evidence is utilized and presented to staff. So as a system, we talked about, perhaps some of you have had this experience. Provincial achievement test results are out. It's data day. Here is your mound of paper. Ka-thunk, let's analyze the data, break it down, plus or minus 5% in which categories, and now let's create our goals. How we as school leaders and as a system present evidence that is accessible. And I appreciated Kevin's reference to how he didn't just take the graphs and throw them out on a table to have teachers ask questions of it. In fact, he created things that are meaningful to connect or to assist teachers in connecting and asking questions of how they might use that evidence. That is a key part to really changing some of the ways teachers perhaps are willing to enter into the question of what their students are telling them. The final one, not the final one, it's the last one that I'll have on this piece, is the ongoing support for new administrators to disaggregate and identifying priorities for use. So Peter, your little run through there of disaggregating all the different pieces, I'm a little bit of a disaggregation junkie. It can be a black hole, but it also can be the most exciting, empowering opportunity to recognize the difference that our schools and teachers have made over the course of 3 years. And as school leaders, we need to ensure we are bringing that to the forefront and that it is targeted and planned, not just something we randomly show up at the beginning of the year and say, hey, look, we did so well this year. We don't know why. Pull it apart. Know who those students are in those grades. And so as a system, or as somebody working out of central office, when I go and work with admin teams, these are the questions I'm asking to understand. Another tool that we've utilized, and again around creating language that is common, it's just a simple summary of understanding what's the thinking process that I, as a school principal, would go through as I'm looking at all the range of evidence that I have access to. Under setting priorities, what are the priorities we're looking at setting? What is the data or the evidence that is available to me, and know what it does and what it doesn't do. Sometimes evidence overload can certainly occur, but know what it can do for you and what it is doing for you and what you're not going to use it for. Documentation and display. How are we documenting? How are we displaying our evidence? When? Is it always something different every time? Or can we use the same pieces over the course of the year? You can use our school to be able to go through each one of these questions at multiple times in the year. Many of us only do it over the Prairie survey frame in terms of the Alberta context. However, right now we had our schools going through the bullying and harassment portion just now again because they wanted to explore that further. So over May, June, we know what May, June can be like. Let's understand where our students are at in that specific area. And then understanding what the difference is between analysis and interpretation. So these are some of the key things that we talk about under analysis in looking at patterns of the evidence of our school results specifically. And then some prompts for interpretation and how do we understand those pieces. And at the very end, this whole concept of action. Action tomorrow. Not next year, tomorrow. In my own practice, our practice as a school or grade level team, as a school and as a system. School profiles are not new, and many districts use them. A question that I had 3 years ago entering into this role was creating a consistent conversation amongst our schools to really empower our school principals and vice principals to engage in something that goes beyond a surface level professional conversation. Something that allowed them to dig into and beyond generalities of, yeah, we've got some really tough kids in this grade. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And then we've got these teachers who are doing this really exciting work with these students, and we're seeing huge progress. In what area? To what end? What are they doing specifically? And so as a school profile, and I recognize you're not going to be able to see these pieces, I'll have our school results pop out. But on our school profiles, we have all of our standard codes. We've got enrollment, we've added attendance for each of the areas. We have a little summary spot for, there we go. School priorities and challenges connected to our strategic framework, and it's a small text box This is on an 11 by 17 non-tech sheet of paper. You need to be able to, as a school principal, identify your key priorities with very brief detail, because that's the clarity that is required in this work. We also have added our district satisfaction surveys, which get asked of our staff and our parents. That's separate from the APORI because we get an excellent response rate for these. And as a result, it really is information and data that we're able to act on, whereas our APORI results, we recognize that that's sometimes a smaller set of parents, and so we want to balance those and triangulate those pieces. What you don't see is on the back half is the APORI achievement results, as well as the parent survey results from the accountability questionnaire as well. Over here, we have some achievement pieces around Foundress and Pinnell and the Ontario Comprehension Assessment, and those have validity, but we have lots of discussion around implementation and use of that achievement data. But again, it's to, triangulate to our standardized assessments that we use. The Our School results, though, is a specific spot where we wanted to move beyond, I look at anxiety. We wanted to dig in, how can our students inform us around the quality of instruction that we have currently happening in our classrooms? And what does that look like in your school and in your school configuration? And when we have this summary of all of our schools and we start asking questions together around what is your approach to supporting transition between grade 8 and grade 9? What are the additional staffing pieces and resources you might have put into that particular transition? When did you do that? What was the impact of that on students in their level of confidence to enter into a new class? And so the Our School results, and in here you'll see we've chosen, though are not married to, and this is not scientific, and I was a little bit nervous actually about some statistical experts being in this room, because I would love to hear more about, hey, you should have thought about using this piece in this category because it can be improved. Relevance, rigor, interest, and anxiety relevance, rigor, and interest and motivation were the three areas that we were using to start the conversation at sites individually. As a system, again, we see trends amongst our grade levels. And as a system, when we look at our allocations of counseling time, of our family outreach workers, all of those things empower us to be very clear why we are using certain positions to meet certain goals. And it's coming from our students. And then can be connected to what are our parent perceptions of the impact of that work as well. I've not referenced the individual student focus groups. I know there's going to be other people giving great examples of that. That's work ongoing in our sites, absolutely, to dig into this deeper and in different ways at different sites. When you have a high school of, one thing I've gained appreciation for, a high school of 1,100 students implementing the Our School survey, for the vice principal team, that's a little bit of a nightmare. Right? The sheer time associated with having that many students go through the survey. That was a point of conversation. We had to get over that particular challenge. I don't know that we're over it, but it's this discussion of the value of the student voice and how we set it up. Examples of guiding questions, and I didn't pop this one out. I was uncertain as to how it would show up, but we use many documents to I've worked together with a number of different principals and vice principals where they've identified, you know, Joe, we need some guiding documents that help us think about our planning and help us think about how we're going to use Our School results, and again, as something more than a graph. And so we looked at guiding questions for analysis, and these are all, they're out there, they're available, but it's bringing it together with purpose and not just saying, hey, we got these survey results in, go take a look at what your PowerPoint will look like. Understanding what patterns do you notice in student feedback in relation to instruction, engagement, relationships. It's not just about one category. As a former school principal, I know my first default was looking at, do I feel safe at school? Right? Those basic needs, you go to those measures first. Recognizing, though, that we need to look at other measures as well. Guiding questions for interpretation. Based on the results, what assumptions have we made about our students? This one is interesting. Again, you'll notice a pattern. We're not just rushing and looking at numbers. We're considering how we're intentionally connecting it to other pieces. So, on your right-hand side, the purposeful engagement piece is connected to social, institutional, and intellectual engagement. That's nothing different than what you see in your engagement summary reports that you can print off from our school. So this year, what we've been playing around with is what other categories might we create? And so I did a little mock-up for you. It's missing a key one, though, in this particular chart around effective learning time as well, and I realized afterwards I had forgotten to add it in. So one of our particular goals in quality instruction, or in our strategic framework, is quality instruction. What about the Our School measures will inform the levels of quality instruction at each grade level, breaking it down to a school, by male or female, over the course of which years? We have a young city that is a swiftly growing population. We have had significant reconfigurations and boundary changes last year. That has had a huge impact on our staff, of over 20% of our staff moving sites. That has an impact. And we need to understand what that looks like in the context of sites that used to be 950 students and have gone down to 300 because of our boundary changes and new schools opening up. And our school results have helped us, but our strategic analysis of that and then supporting principals in asking questions of what are the trends and patterns you're seeing and what are your responses in relevance and rigor, interest and motivation, and effective learning time. What does that mean for the professional learning we want to engage in and support our teachers with? So we're playing around a bit with the categories, and while our school results already set categories, you have the career pathways categories, you've got these other pieces. Again, to try to avoid packaging everything really neatly and understanding what the landscape is from our students is going to be important. So considerations that we're really looking at, and that actually a month ago, because we were having some dialogue at our principal meeting table, my question immediately was, which evidence do we find we tend to focus on first? What might that tell you about your community, if that's the first evidence that you're wanting to know about your community? What does that tell you about where you're at in your understanding of what the survey is actually measuring? And how deeply do we understand which questions make up each of those categories? It's easy to just look at the results and leave it at that, but understanding what is truly behind each one of those questions is key to leveraging your planning. And so that's our conversation as leaders. And then which evidence might we use to guide? And if I were looking at categories, when my colleague James Robinson is sitting with me here, and he's the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services, and he's been so gracious in allowing me to run into his office 1 or 50 times and say, okay, James, I've got to ask you, I'm looking at the data this way, and how do you think this might inform this aspect of student services specifically? And how might we understand our allocation of counseling time, and not just our allocation of counseling time across our schools, but in fact inform the focus of their work? We're seeing a pattern where, much of our counseling time was focused on individual student counseling time. But based on what we're hearing from students, we're seeing a pattern that perhaps we should shift the focus of that work At what grade level might we do that? Well, our evidence is showing us that perhaps we should really be targeting our grade 5s and 6s. That allows a system to make different choices about resources that everybody holds closely. And then we're starting from a point of conversation about how we can together, not just as your school or my school, but together and collectively utilize those key resources and those funds. When we look at scheduling as a site, as a school site, we talk a lot about our school schedules for our students. How do our school schedules overall create and support teachers in developing effective learning time for their students, and how might they undermine it? And so some of our schools, we're really looking at the variety of specialist teachers they had and the challenge that they were then having of that interrupting. There was no sustained learning time within their school schedules. They were able to start the conversation with teachers as a result of the evidence from our school results. Because our students are saying that they don't have effective learning time. They're saying in their comments, I feel bounced around all the time. They're identifying those concerns. And so our school results specifically allow that. When we look at school structures, and I actually will reference the anxiety piece. One of our high schools, they use teacher advisory groups, and they use regular, actually I think it's every week, they use some form of focus group within their teacher advisory groups. And they had looked at their anxiety measure shortly after everything coming out, and the principal, who really is all about asking questions, she mused, what's wrapped up in this? And so as a few staff members, they came up with some key questions they wanted to ask their focus groups. This is not a big production. The kids are used to being asked these questions during teacher advisory time, and so they were asked some specific questions. It came out as a result of the inquiring into the anxiety measure. Kids did not want to eat in the common area. They hated it because it's a large school and they felt that everybody was looking at them, and so they weren't eating. You can see how this might tie into some other pieces they could be responding to on the survey as well. So the next day, this is what came back at the end of the school day. The next day, principal sent out an email to staff. We received some interesting responses from our students, and we were wondering, our students we're hearing from our students, they do not like eating in the common area. Perhaps might some of you consider opening up your classrooms over lunch and allowing a range of places for students to be able to eat in. Response was overwhelming. Teachers like, what? Of course, that makes total sense. I can totally see why they might feel intimidated to eat in that gigantic room with everybody else watching them, or they think everybody else is watching them. And as a result of that, 15 classrooms opened up. Teachers are now sitting with students over lunch, lots of other conversations, and you can appreciate many, or as one would expect, many other offshoots in terms of positive student-teacher relations, advocacy at school, all those other pieces that you could tie in to that small question that they asked within their classroom. The last piece that I'll touch on is in relation to programming. All of us have sports leagues. Our kids are involved in sports. There's the key questions around participation in sports and clubs. With our school reconfigurations and grade 9s moving to the high school, our grade 7 and 8 students, their participation in clubs went way down. We had all kinds of interesting things happening, and we had a very traditional approach collectively to competitive sports leagues, A and B teams moving through that. As a system, we were seeing this as a trend. And in no way will I take any accolades for this, because we had a group of grade 7 and 8 committed teachers who said, well, does your school feel, is that what your students are saying? Because that's what our students are saying. They started this conversation as phys ed teachers and decided to completely blow up the way the league was set up. So in a jurisdiction of 17 schools, and within that, most of our school configurations are K-8. Our grade 7 and 8 student number of teams was at an all-time low of about 16. This year, 31. And this was developed over a series of very specific planning and hard work by committed teachers and school leaders who said, our students should not feel or should have a range of entry points into being part of a team. So what about our traditional athletic structures do we need to change? How will our community support that? That's where our district satisfaction surveys come in to help us understand what our parents also think. But 31 basketball teams, we had a hard time finding coaches, I will tell you that. That meant that we had well over 50% of our kids playing on a team for basketball season alone. That's just a small example. That doesn't account for those students who played volleyball but not basketball. You look at that, and that came from a mindset of inquiring into what is the evidence that this practice is having this impact. And when a whole system is engaging in that conversation, you open the door to dig into past practice that perhaps could go quicker than you possibly ever could have imagined. When we focus our priorities, we're able to create a sense of belonging. When we focus our priorities, we're able to be advocates for our students because we're not wrung out by professional whiplash at every other thing that's being shot at us, that this new program we should take, this new expert who can come in and make it all better. Us knowing where we are at based on the mindset we as a system, schools, and teacher teams create allows us to move into something very specific. And that, to me, is all about creating coherence. The Our School results can be used as a complete one-off. They can be used as a stick. They can be used as an excuse. They can be used and should be as the piece that allows us to take action. Our students, we have a fabulous baseline now. And again, it can be a little bit of a black hole if you love numbers because you dig into all these other details and what ifs. But when connected to a strategic framework and an approach to inquiry, you can be very focused. Creating the mindset of informing the system to inquire into patterns is key to this. And the attitude of responsiveness. The belief that I know what I'm doing, I know why I'm doing it, and I know when I'm doing it. So the theme in many of my colleagues and what they've heard from me regularly, well, Joanne, I know what you're going to ask me, or actually I know what you're going to tell me, and that is, know why you're doing what you're doing when you're doing it. And if you can reflect on each of these three areas as an individual, as a team, as a school, and as a system, we will have collective efficacy. The belief that us together can have an impact on the learning of those students that far exceeds the external pressures that they currently experience. Because we know what we control in our buildings and in our classrooms. And our students, through the Our School results, are able to really provide us a starting point to strategically dig into pieces that are far more than just a soft measure. So if you know where to tap, you'll watch it hum. Thanks very much for your time.